Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the basement of the Virginia Historical Society, dust particles floating in the dim light as she carefully opened a leather-bound ledger from 1855. She was 62 years old, a retired Army nurse who'd served 3 tours in Iraq before dedicating her life to historical research. Her colleagues often dismissed her work as obsessive, and the younger historians at the university whispered that she was chasing ghosts. But Sarah didn't care what they thought. She'd spent 30 years in uniform being underestimated because she was a woman. She'd learned to let her work speak for itself. The ledger contained auction records from Richmond's largest slave market. Sarah had been researching her family history for 5 years, trying to trace her ancestors back through slavery. Her grandmother had told stories before she died, stories about a man named Elijah who'd been sold in Richmond for an impossible price, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and who was Sarah's great-great-great-grandfather. Most historians told Sarah the stories were legend, embellished over generations. They said records were too incomplete to trace. They suggested she was wasting her time. But Sarah had learned something in the army: persistence breaks through walls that talent alone cannot. She ran her finger down the auction records, reading name after name, price after price. And then she found it. April 12, 1855. Elijah, male, approximately 28 years. Sold to Harrison Chambers. Price, $25,000. Sarah's breath caught. $25,000 in 1855 was equivalent to nearly $1 million today. It was the highest price she'd ever seen in any auction record. She pulled out her notebook and began copying the information. But as she read further, she found something strange. Below the sale price was a notation in different ink, added later: insurance claim filed August 1855. Subject: disappearance. Status: disputed. Insurance claim. Sarah's mind raced. Why would someone file an insurance claim on an enslaved person? She spent the next 4 hours searching through related documents. In a box of correspondence from the same period, she found letters from Harrison Chambers to an insurance company in London. The letters were businesslike and cold, discussing property loss and mysterious circumstances. But one letter stood out. It was from Chambers' wife, Margaret, written to her sister in Charleston, dated July 1855. Dear sister, the most troubling event has occurred. The slave Harrison purchased for such an enormous sum has vanished. Harrison claims he disappeared in the night, though how this could happen from a locked room with guards posted, I cannot fathom. Harrison seems more concerned with the insurance money than with recovering his property. Something about this situation feels wrong, but Harrison becomes angry when I question him. I fear there is more to this story than he admits. Sarah photographed the letter with trembling hands. Margaret Chambers had suspected something was wrong. A woman in 1855 had seen through her husband's story but had no power to act on her suspicions. Sarah knew that feeling. She'd seen things during her military service, abuses of power, cover-ups, injustice, and had often been told to stay quiet, to not make trouble, to let the men handle it. But Sarah had never been good at staying quiet. Over the next 3 months, Sarah dug deeper. She found insurance records showing that Chambers had insured Elijah for the full purchase price just days after buying him. She found newspaper articles from 1855 describing Elijah's mysterious disappearance and the massive reward Chambers offered for his return. She found testimonies from enslaved people on Chambers' plantation, recorded years later by Union officers during the Civil War. One testimony particularly caught her attention, from a woman named Ruth, who'd been the house cook. Master Chambers bought that man Elijah in the spring of 1855. Paid more money than anyone ever heard of for a slave. Elijah was beautiful, yes, but that's not why the price was so high. Master Chambers was planning something. I heard him tell his overseer, "This investment will solve all my problems." 3 months later, Elijah disappeared. Master Chambers said he escaped, but I know that's not true. I saw Master Chambers and the overseer digging in the woods the night before Elijah disappeared. I saw them carry something heavy wrapped in canvas. I saw the fresh dirt in the morning. But I couldn't say nothing. I was enslaved. My word meant nothing against a white man. And Master Chambers threatened anyone who spoke about Elijah. He said if we talked, we'd be sold south to the worst plantations. But I'm telling you now because the war is over and Master Chambers is dead. Elijah didn't escape. Elijah was murdered. And Master Chambers buried him somewhere on that plantation. Sarah read Ruth's testimony 3 times, feeling ice in her veins. This wasn't a mysterious disappearance. This was murder and insurance fraud. She brought her findings to the head of the Historical Society, Dr. Robert Crawford, a distinguished historian who'd been dismissive of Sarah's research from the beginning. "Dr. Crawford, I need to show you something. I've found evidence that the famous 1855 disappearance of the slave sold for $25,000 wasn't a disappearance at all. It was murder." Crawford barely looked up from his desk. "Dr. Mitchell, we've discussed this. Your family history research is commendable, but you can't make sensational claims based on unverified testimony from enslaved people. The testimony was recorded by Union officers. It's official Army records. Testimony from enslaved people was notoriously unreliable. They often made accusations against former owners out of spite." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. Or they told the truth about crimes they'd witnessed but couldn't report because enslaved people's testimony wasn't admissible in court. Crawford sighed. "Dr. Mitchell, I know you want to believe your ancestor was special, that there's some dramatic story here. But the most likely explanation is simple: this Elijah escaped, died somewhere unknown, and was never found. That's not uncommon. The mystery is just a gap in records, not evidence of murder. There are insurance records. Chambers filed a claim for $25,000 after Elijah disappeared. That's motive for fraud. Or it's a legitimate claim by a man who lost valuable property. Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to be frank with you. You're letting personal investment cloud your historical judgment. This vendetta you have against Harrison Chambers. It's not a vendetta. It's an investigation. It's obsessive. And it's making you look unprofessional. I'm recommending you take a break from this research and focus on other projects." Sarah stared at him, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. She was being told to back down, to stop making trouble, to let the comfortable narrative stand. Just like she'd been told so many times in the army when she'd reported problems. She'd learned something then that served her now: when institutions fail to pursue justice, individuals must. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Crawford," Sarah said quietly, gathering her documents. She walked out of his office knowing she was on her own. The Historical Society wouldn't help her. The university historians thought she was obsessed. Her family worried she was wasting her retirement on an impossible quest. But Sarah had one advantage they didn't know about: she was a trained investigator. In the army, she'd worked with criminal investigations, helping document war crimes and medical misconduct. She knew how to build a case. She knew how to find evidence others missed. And she knew that the truth, no matter how long buried, leaves traces. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment in Richmond, surrounded by copied documents and photographs. She pulled out the map she'd been working on, a reconstruction of the Chambers plantation based on historical surveys and property records. Ruth's testimony said she'd seen Chambers and the overseer digging in the woods. Sarah studied the plantation map, looking for wooded areas that would have been private enough for a secret burial. She found 3 possible locations. One was now underneath a shopping mall. One was now a residential neighborhood. But one, a section of woods on the far edge of what had been the plantation, was still undeveloped land, currently owned by the county as a nature preserve. Sarah made a decision. She would go to those woods. She would search the area. And if she found evidence of a burial site, she would bring in proper authorities regardless of what the historical society thought. 3 days later, Sarah drove to the nature preserve. It was early morning, mist still hanging between the trees. She wore hiking boots and carried a backpack with water, a GPS unit, and a metal detector she'd borrowed from a friend. She'd told no one where she was going. If she was wrong, she didn't want more people thinking she was crazy. The woods were quiet except for bird calls and the crunch of leaves under her boots. Sarah used her GPS to navigate to the area that matched Ruth's description, a section of woods that would have been far from the main plantation house but still on the property. She began walking in a grid pattern, using the metal detector to scan for any anomalies underground. Modern burial sites would have metal from coffins or belongings. But a burial from 1855, especially a secret one, would be simpler, just disturbed earth and possibly bones. She'd been searching for 3 hours when the metal detector gave a strong signal. Sarah's heart raced as she marked the spot with a flag. She moved in concentric circles around it and found 2 more signals nearby. Metal buried in a pattern. Not random trash. Something deliberate. Sarah took photographs, marked GPS coordinates, and carefully examined the ground. There was a slight depression in the earth, barely visible after 170 years, but there if you knew what to look for. She sat down on a fallen log, hands shaking. This could be it. This could be Elijah's grave. But she couldn't dig here herself. Disturbing a potential burial site without proper authority was illegal. And even if she found remains, she'd need forensic experts to examine them properly. She needed help. Real help. Not from historians who dismissed her, but from law enforcement and forensic anthropologists. Sarah pulled out her phone and made a call to someone she'd worked with years ago, Detective Maria Alvarez, now with the Richmond Police Department's cold case unit. They'd served together in Iraq and had stayed in touch. Maria? It's Sarah Mitchell. I need your help with something that's going to sound crazy, but I need you to trust me. Sarah? Of course. What's going on? I think I found evidence of a murder from 1855. A burial site. And I think I can prove it was insurance fraud and homicide, if we can get forensic analysis done. There was a pause. Then Maria said, "Give me the GPS coordinates. I'm coming out there." And Sarah? If you're right about this, it's going to be big. I know. That's what I'm counting on. Sarah waited in the woods for Maria to arrive, watching sunlight filter through the trees onto ground that might hold her ancestors' remains. She thought about Elijah, who'd been valued at $25,000 not because he was human but because he was beautiful property. Who'd been murdered and buried in secret, his death covered up by a man who valued insurance money more than human life. She thought about Ruth, who'd witnessed the murder but couldn't report it because enslaved people's testimony was worthless in court. Who'd carried the truth for years until she could finally speak it. And she thought about herself, a woman who'd spent her life being underestimated, being told to stay quiet, being dismissed when she pursued uncomfortable truths. Not anymore. The sound of a car pulling up on the access road broke her thoughts. Maria had arrived. And with her, Sarah could see, were 2 other people, a forensic anthropologist from Virginia Commonwealth University and someone from the county medical examiner's office. Sarah stood up and walked to meet them, her military bearing returning. She was about to present her case for excavating a potential crime scene from 170 years ago. And she was going to make them listen. Because Elijah deserved justice, even if it came 170 years late. And Sarah Mitchell had never walked away from a mission. The excavation began 2 weeks later, after Sarah had presented her evidence to the Richmond Police Department, the County Medical Examiner, and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. She'd laid out everything methodically, the auction records showing the unprecedented price, the insurance policy taken out days after purchase, the mysterious disappearance, Margaret Chambers' letter expressing suspicion, Ruth's testimony about witnessing the burial, and the metal detector readings in the woods. Most officials were skeptical. But Maria Alvarez had vouched for Sarah's credibility, and Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the forensic anthropologist, was intrigued enough by the evidence to support the excavation. Even if we don't find human remains, Dr. Hayes had said, this is an important historical site. Ruth's testimony suggests enslaved people were buried here, and that alone warrants investigation. On the morning the excavation began, news crews appeared. Someone had leaked the story, and suddenly Sarah's quiet investigation was public. The headline in the Richmond Times-Dispatch read, "Retired Army Nurse Claims 1855 Mysterious Disappearance Was Actually Murder." The article was skeptical, quoting Dr. Crawford from the Historical Society, "Dr. Mitchell is a dedicated researcher, but she's making extraordinary claims based on limited evidence. We shouldn't sensationalize historical gaps in knowledge." But the article also quoted Maria Alvarez, "Dr. Mitchell has compiled compelling evidence that warrants investigation. If there's even a possibility that a murder was committed and covered up, we have a responsibility to pursue the truth." Sarah stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching the team carefully remove layers of soil. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. News cameras filmed her, and reporters shouted questions, but Sarah ignored them. She was focused entirely on the excavation. 3 hours into the dig, Dr. Hayes suddenly stopped and carefully brushed soil away from something. She looked up at the team, her expression serious. "We have bone. Human bone." Sarah felt her legs weaken. Maria grabbed her arm, steadying her. "We found him," Sarah whispered. "We actually found him." The excavation continued for 2 more days. The team uncovered a complete skeleton, buried in a shallow grave with no coffin or funeral rites. The skeleton was male, approximately 6 feet tall, with bone structure consistent with African ancestry. But the most significant finding was the skull. It showed clear evidence of trauma, a fracture consistent with a blow from a heavy object. Dr. Hayes examined it carefully before looking up at Sarah, Maria, and the assembled officials. This individual died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The injury pattern suggests he was struck from behind with something heavy, possibly a shovel or metal bar. This was not an accident. This was homicide. The news spread quickly. What had been a skeptical story about a retired nurse chasing family legends suddenly became a bombshell, evidence of a 170-year-old murder, potentially connected to insurance fraud. But Sarah's fight was just beginning. Now she had to prove that these remains were Elijah, and that Harrison Chambers had murdered him. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the remains were discovered, Sarah received a phone call from a woman named Catherine Chambers Wright. "Dr. Mitchell. My name is Catherine. I'm a descendant of Harrison Chambers. I need to speak with you about what you found." Sarah's first instinct was to be cautious. Family members often defended their ancestors, even in the face of evidence. But when Catherine arrived at Sarah's apartment that evening, she brought a box of documents that had been in her family for generations. "My family has always known something was wrong with the story about Elijah," Catherine said. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, with kind eyes that looked tired. "My great-great-grandmother Margaret, Harrison's wife, kept a diary. She never believed Elijah escaped. She suspected Harrison had done something terrible. But she had no power to investigate, and after Harrison died, the family buried the truth to protect the family name. Catherine opened the box and pulled out an old diary. This is Margaret's diary from 1855. She wrote about Elijah's disappearance. And Dr. Mitchell, she wrote about things that support everything you found. Sarah read the diary entries with shaking hands. July 15, 1855, Elijah is gone. Harrison claims he escaped, but the circumstances make no sense. The room was locked. The windows were barred. The guards saw nothing. Harrison seems more concerned with contacting the insurance company than with finding Elijah. When I asked why he was so quick to file an insurance claim rather than searching for an escaped slave, he became angry and told me it was none of my concern. I am troubled by Harrison's behavior. 2 nights ago, I woke to strange sounds, men talking, the sound of digging. When I asked Harrison about it in the morning, he said it was servants working on drainage ditches. But there were no new drainage ditches, and the servants seemed confused when I mentioned it. I fear something terrible has happened. I fear my husband has done something unforgivable. But I am a woman with no rights, no power. Who would believe me over my husband? Sarah looked up at Catherine, tears in her eyes. She knew. She knew, but she couldn't do anything. Yes. And it haunted her for the rest of her life. She wrote in later entries about her guilt, about knowing the truth but being powerless to speak it. She died believing she'd failed Elijah by not finding a way to expose what Harrison had done. Catherine pulled out another document, a letter written by Margaret to her sister in 1867, 12 years later. Dear sister, Harrison is dead now, taken by pneumonia. I should mourn him as a wife should, but I feel only relief that his cruelty has ended. I have lived for 12 years knowing he murdered that man Elijah and collected insurance money on his death. I have lived knowing a human being is buried somewhere on our property, unmourned and unacknowledged. I cannot make this public even now. The scandal would destroy our family. But I write this letter so that someone will know the truth, even if it cannot be spoken openly. Harrison Chambers murdered an enslaved man named Elijah in July 1855 and buried him in the woods east of the main house. He filed a false insurance claim, claiming Elijah had mysteriously disappeared. He was paid $12,500, half the insured value, after months of negotiation. Harrison used this money to save himself from bankruptcy. Our family's current security is built on the profit from murder. I am ashamed. I am guilty for my silence. I pray that someday, somehow, justice will be done for that poor man. Sarah and Catherine sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Catherine spoke. Dr. Mitchell, my family has benefited from that murder for 170 years. The money Harrison got from the insurance claim saved his plantation. That wealth has been passed down through generations. Everything my family has achieved was built on blood money. What are you going to do? Sarah asked quietly. I'm going to testify. I'm going to provide these documents to the authorities. I'm going to acknowledge publicly what my ancestor did. And my family is going to establish a fund, compensation for descendants of people Harrison enslaved, starting with your family if we can prove these remains are your ancestor. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. You're destroying your family's reputation to tell the truth. No. I'm finally allowing my family to have integrity. Margaret wanted the truth told. She wanted justice for Elijah. It's 170 years late, but I can finally give her that. Over the next months, the investigation accelerated. Forensic analysis of the remains confirmed they were consistent with a man who died in the 1850s. The skull fracture was definitively homicide. Metal found near the burial site was identified as buttons and a belt buckle from clothing typical of that period. DNA analysis was more complicated. Sarah provided her own DNA, and researchers began the painstaking work of comparing it to degraded DNA from the skeletal remains. The science was imperfect for remains this old, but they could potentially determine if Sarah and the skeleton shared ancestry. While waiting for results, Sarah focused on building the complete story. With Catherine's help, she accessed Chambers' family records that had been kept private for generations. She found Harrison Chambers' personal account books showing him in serious debt before Elijah's purchase, and then suddenly solvent after the insurance payout. She found correspondence between Chambers and the insurance company, where Chambers had pushed hard for full payment of the claim despite the company's suspicions about the circumstances. Most damning, she found a letter Chambers had written to his brother just before Elijah's death. "Brother, my financial difficulties will soon be resolved. The investment I made in the slave has attracted significant insurance interest. Should anything unfortunate befall this property, the compensation would be substantial. One way or another, this acquisition will save my plantation." Sarah brought everything to Detective Alvarez, who was working with prosecutors to determine if they could bring any charges. The legal situation was complex. Harrison Chambers was long dead, beyond the reach of justice. But there were questions about whether his estate had benefited from criminal proceeds, whether descendants could be liable, and whether the insurance company that had paid the fraudulent claim could seek restitution from the Chambers estate. More importantly, there was the question of historical justice. Could authorities officially declare that Elijah had been murdered? Could they formally acknowledge the crime and honor the victim? The DNA results came back in November, 6 months after the excavation began. Dr. Hayes called Sarah with the news. "Sarah, we have results. The degraded DNA from the remains shares genetic markers consistent with African ancestry from the Senegambia region. And Sarah, we found a match. The remains share mitochondrial DNA with you. This is your ancestor. This is Elijah." Sarah sat down heavily, feeling the weight of 170 years of family history settling on her shoulders. The stories her grandmother had told were true. The legend of the beautiful man sold for an impossible price, who disappeared mysteriously, was real. And he hadn't disappeared. He'd been murdered and buried in an unmarked grave. For 170 years, her family had carried these stories, and for 170 years, most people had dismissed them as embellishment or fiction. But Sarah had proved them true. She called Catherine Chambers right to tell her the news. Catherine's response was immediate: "Then we know what we need to do. We need to give Elijah a proper burial. We need to formally acknowledge what happened. And we need to face the truth as a community." But not everyone agreed. When news of the DNA match became public, backlash began. Some historians accused Sarah of fabricating evidence. Some Chambers family members, Catherine's cousins, accused her of attacking their ancestors' reputation for attention. Some people claimed the DNA evidence was unreliable and the whole thing was a publicity stunt. Dr. Crawford from the Historical Society gave an interview. "While I respect Dr. Mitchell's dedication, I remain skeptical of the conclusions being drawn. We have a body with head trauma, yes, but to claim definitively that this is Elijah, that he was murdered by Harrison Chambers, and that it was part of an insurance fraud scheme, that's connecting dots in ways that go beyond what the evidence supports." Sarah watched the interview in her apartment, feeling the familiar sting of being dismissed, being told she was wrong, being painted as an obsessive woman chasing fantasies. But then her phone rang. It was Maria Alvarez. "Sarah, turn on channel 6. Now." Sarah switched channels and found a press conference. The Richmond Commonwealth's attorney, a woman named Janet Rodriguez, stood at a podium surrounded by officials from the police department, the medical examiner's office, and the attorney general's office. Rodriguez spoke clearly and firmly. after a thorough investigation lasting 6 months, involving forensic analysis, historical research, and examination of contemporary documents, we have reached the following conclusions. First, the human remains discovered in May of this year are those of a man who died approximately 170 years ago from homicide, specifically, blunt force trauma to the skull. Second, the evidence strongly suggests these remains are those of Elijah, an enslaved man purchased by Harrison Chambers in April 1855 for $25,000 and reported missing in July 1855. Third, documentary evidence, including contemporaneous testimony from witnesses and personal correspondence from Chambers and his wife, supports the conclusion that Elijah was murdered by Harrison Chambers. Fourth, evidence shows that Chambers filed an insurance claim on Elijah's life and received $12,500 from that claim, suggesting the murder was motivated by financial gain. While we obviously cannot prosecute Harrison Chambers, who died in 1862, we can and will formally declare that Elijah was the victim of homicide. The Commonwealth of Virginia officially acknowledges this crime and honors Elijah's memory. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as Rodriguez continued. This investigation was made possible by the dedication of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who refused to accept dismissal of her family's history. She demonstrated that oral histories from enslaved communities deserve serious investigation. She proved that truth, no matter how long buried, can be uncovered. Dr. Mitchell, on behalf of the Commonwealth, thank you for your service to historical justice. Sarah's phone exploded with calls and messages. News crews appeared outside her apartment. But she ignored all of it for the moment. She sat alone in her living room, looking at a photograph of her grandmother that sat on her bookshelf. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I proved the stories were true. I found Elijah. And now the world knows what happened to him." But Sarah knew the work wasn't finished. Finding the truth was only the first step. Now came the harder part, ensuring that Elijah was properly honored, that his story was remembered, and that justice, delayed by 170 years, was finally served in the ways that still mattered. The funeral for Elijah was held on a cold December morning, 170 years and 5 months after his murder. The service took place at a historic black church in Richmond, with burial following at a cemetery reserved for people whose lives had been stolen by slavery. Sarah stood at the front of the church, looking out at hundreds of people who'd come to honor a man they'd never met but whose story had touched them deeply. There were descendants of enslaved people, historians who'd supported Sarah's work, police officers and forensic experts who'd helped with the investigation, and members of the black community who saw Elijah's story as representative of countless untold stories. Catherine Chambers Wright sat in the front row, along with 3 other Chambers descendants who'd chosen to acknowledge their ancestors' crime rather than deny it. The pastor invited Sarah to speak. She walked to the podium, her hands shaking slightly, and looked out at the assembled crowd. "My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell," she began. "I'm a retired Army nurse. I'm a historian. And I'm the great-great-great-granddaughter of the man we're honoring today, Elijah, whose full name we will never know because slavery stole that from him along with everything else. 5 years ago, I started researching my family history. My grandmother had told stories before she died, stories about a man sold for an impossible price, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Most people told me these were just legends. They said I was wasting my time chasing family myths. But I learned something in 30 years of military service: when people tell you to stop asking questions, that's usually when you're getting close to something important. I didn't give up. I searched archives. I found records. I followed evidence. And what I discovered was worse than my grandmother's stories ever suggested. Elijah didn't disappear mysteriously. He was murdered. He was murdered by the man who'd purchased him, for insurance money. He was murdered, buried in an unmarked grave, and erased from history. For 170 years, the official story was that Elijah vanished, a mystery that could never be solved. But that story was a lie. It was a cover-up. And it worked for 170 years because enslaved people's testimony was dismissed, because women's suspicions were ignored, because families protected their reputations over truth. But my family never forgot. My ancestors passed down the truth through generations. And when I finally had the tools and resources to investigate, I found evidence that proved what my family had always known: Elijah was murdered, and Harrison Chambers was his killer. Today, we finally give Elijah what he was denied 170 years ago: acknowledgement, dignity, and a proper burial. Today, we say his name and honor his memory. Today, we declare that his life mattered, that the crime against him was real, and that justice, even when delayed by centuries, still matters. Sarah stepped back from the podium, tears streaming down her face. The congregation stood and applauded, not for her, she knew, but for Elijah, for truth, and for the long, painful journey to justice. Catherine Chambers Wright spoke next, her voice steady despite visible emotion. My name is Catherine, and I'm a descendant of Harrison Chambers, the man who murdered Elijah. I stand here today to acknowledge what my ancestor did. Harrison Chambers purchased Elijah as property, insured him for profit, murdered him for money, and covered up the crime for 170 years. My family benefited from that murder. The insurance money saved Harrison's plantation. That wealth has been passed down through generations. Everything my family achieved was built on blood money. I cannot undo what Harrison did. I cannot bring Elijah back. But I can do this: I can acknowledge the truth. I can apologize publicly. And I can commit my family's resources to making what restitution is possible. Today, the Chambers family is establishing the Elijah Justice Fund with an initial endowment of $5 million. This fund will support education for descendants of enslaved people, fund historical research into slavery and its aftermath, and provide resources for families researching their own histories. This doesn't erase the crime. Nothing can. But it's a start toward acknowledging the debt my family owes to Elijah and to all enslaved people whose lives were stolen and whose stories were buried. Elijah, I speak to you across 170 years, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what my ancestor did. I'm sorry your life was stolen. I'm sorry your death was hidden. But I promise you, your story will be remembered. Your truth will be taught. And your name will be honored. After the service, the procession moved to the cemetery. Elijah's remains, carefully reburied in a proper coffin, were interred with full honors. A headstone was unveiled, paid for by the Chambers family. Elijah. Born in freedom in West Africa, circa 1827. Stolen into slavery, brought to America, 1835. Enslaved for 20 years. Murdered by his enslaver, Harrison Chambers, July 1855. Age approximately 28. His crime, existing as property that could be insured and profited from in death. His legacy, truth that survived 170 years of lies. They tried to make him disappear. His family remembered. His truth emerged. His story lives. As mourners filed past the grave, Sarah stood to the side with Maria Alvarez. You did it, Maria said quietly. You proved what everyone said was impossible to prove. We did it, Sarah corrected. None of this would have happened without your support. What are you going to do now? You've accomplished what you set out to do. Sarah looked at the grave, then at the crowd of people paying their respects. Now I help others do the same thing. There are thousands of families with stories like mine, stories they've been told aren't true, stories they've been discouraged from investigating. I'm going to help them find the truth. Over the next months, Sarah's work took on new dimensions. The publicity from Elijah's case brought her dozens of contacts from people researching their own family histories, looking for ancestors lost to slavery, trying to prove family stories that had been dismissed as legend. Sarah worked with each person who reached out, teaching them research methods, connecting them with resources, encouraging them when institutions tried to dismiss their work. She also accepted a position at Virginia Commonwealth University, not as a full professor. Dr. Crawford and others on the faculty blocked that appointment, but as a researcher in residence, given resources and space to pursue historical investigations. Dr. Crawford remained skeptical of her work, but he was increasingly isolated. Other historians, inspired by Sarah's success, began taking oral histories from black families more seriously, began investigating cases that had previously been dismissed as unsolvable. 6 months after Elijah's funeral, Sarah received an award from the National Association of Black Historians for her contributions to uncovering hidden history. At the ceremony, the president of the association spoke. Dr. Mitchell's work reminds us that history is not just what's written in official records. History is also what's remembered in families, passed down through generations, preserved in communities even when institutions try to erase it. Dr. Mitchell honored her grandmother's stories by refusing to accept that they were merely legend. She proved that oral history from enslaved communities deserves serious investigation. And she showed that persistence, even in the face of institutional dismissal, can uncover truth. But the recognition that meant most to Sarah came in the form of a letter from her cousin, a woman named Jennifer, who'd been skeptical of Sarah's research for years. Cousin Sarah. I owe you an apology. When you started researching Elijah's story 5 years ago, I thought you were wasting your time. I thought Grandma's stories were just family myths. I told you that you were being obsessive, that you should focus on your retirement instead of chasing ghosts. I was wrong. You weren't chasing ghosts. You were pursuing truth. You weren't being obsessive. You were being dedicated. And you didn't waste your time, you honored our family's memory and gave our ancestor the justice he deserved. Because of you, Elijah's name is known. His story is taught. His murder is acknowledged. Children in Virginia schools are learning about him, about the evil of slavery, about how families like ours kept truth alive even when it was dangerous. You were underestimated. You were dismissed. People called you obsessive and said you were wasting your time. But you were right, and they were wrong. I'm proud to be your cousin. I'm proud to be Elijah's descendant. And I'm grateful you had the courage to keep fighting when everyone told you to give up. With love and respect. Jennifer. Sarah kept that letter on her desk, reading it on difficult days when her work felt overwhelming or when she faced institutional resistance. 1 year after Elijah's remains were discovered, Sarah organized a symposium at VCU on Hidden Histories, researching slavery's aftermath in family oral traditions. Hundreds of people attended, historians, genealogists, descendants of enslaved people, and people researching their own family stories. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the forensic anthropologist who'd helped excavate Elijah's grave, presented on the scientific methods used to analyze historical remains. Catherine Chambers Wright spoke about how families could begin to acknowledge difficult ancestral histories. And Sarah led workshops on research methods and navigating archives. On the final day of the symposium, a young black woman approached Sarah during a break. She was in her 20s, carrying a notebook, and she looked nervous. Dr. Mitchell. My name is Destiny. My grandmother told stories about our ancestor, a woman sold in New Orleans in 1850, who supposedly disappeared after being purchased by a wealthy family. Everyone in my family says the stories are embellished. But after hearing about your work, I'm wondering if maybe they're true. Can you help me research? Sarah smiled and gestured to an empty chair. Sit down. Tell me everything your grandmother told you. And then let's figure out how to find the truth. As Destiny began telling her family's stories, Sarah thought about how far she'd come. 5 years ago, she'd been a retired nurse with a family legend and no idea how to investigate it. She'd been dismissed, mocked, and told to give up. But she hadn't given up. She'd pursued truth with the same dedication she'd brought to military service. She'd honored her grandmother's memory by proving the stories were real. And she'd given Elijah what he deserved, acknowledgement, dignity, and justice. Now she was helping others do the same. And that, Sarah realized, was how justice worked when it came 170 years late. You couldn't undo the original crime. You couldn't bring back the dead or restore what was stolen. But you could tell the truth. You could honor the memory. You could ensure the story was remembered and taught. And you could help others find their own truths, recover their own histories, and honor their own ancestors. Sarah looked at Destiny, this young woman eager to learn her family's true history, and felt hope. Every family story investigated, every truth uncovered, every ancestor honored, it was all part of a larger process of historical justice. It was slow. It was difficult. It often faced resistance. But it mattered. Elijah had been stolen from Africa, enslaved for 20 years, murdered for insurance money, and buried in an unmarked grave. His killer had died wealthy and respected, never facing consequences for his crime. But 170 years later, the truth emerged. The crime was acknowledged. The victim was honored. And the family that had carried his memory for generations finally saw that memory validated. That was justice, imperfect, delayed, but real. And Sarah Mitchell, the retired Army nurse who'd been underestimated and dismissed, who'd been told she was wasting her time chasing family legends, had made it happen. She'd fought for truth when institutions failed. She'd persisted when everyone told her to give up. She'd honored her grandmother's stories by proving them real. And she'd given Elijah, beautiful, murdered, nearly forgotten Elijah, the dignity and acknowledgement he deserved. The incredible mystery of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in Richmond had been solved. The truth had been revealed. Justice had been served. And Sarah's work continued, helping others find their own truths, one family story at a time.